Good evening, everybody. The Lord has promised a special blessing when we open the Scriptures, and especially when we would read in the book of Revelation. 7 times we find a blessing there. Of course, I refer now especially back to chapter 1, verse 3. But even when we read a chapter like chapter 17, which is before us tonight, even there we might receive a blessing in reading, in studying, although the subject itself has to do with judgment. Let us first read the chapter then. Revelation 17. And one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 bowls, came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show thee the sentence of the great harlot, who sits upon the many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. And they that dwell on the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. And he carried me away in spirit to a desert. And I saw a woman sitting upon a scarlet beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and had ornaments of gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and the unclean things of her fornication. And upon her forehead a name written, Mystery, Great Babylon, the mother of the harlot, and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And I wondered, seeing her, with great wonder. And the angel said to me, Why hast thou wondered? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, and of the beast which carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast which thou sawest was, and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss, and go into destruction. And they who dwell on the earth, whose names are not written from the founding of the world in the book of life, shall wonder, seeing the beast that it was, and is not, and shall be present. Here is the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains whereon the woman sits, and there are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes he must remain only a little while. And the beast that was and is not, he also is an 8th, and is of the 7, and goes into destruction. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have not yet received the kingdom, but receive authority as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and give their power and authority to the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him, called and chosen and faithful. And he says to me, The waters which thou sawest, where the harlot sits, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which thou sawest, and the beast, these shall hate the harlot, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and shall burn her with fire. For God has given to their hearts to do his mind, and to act with one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is the great city, which has kingship over the kings of the earth. So far the reading of the scripture. Now you may remember that this book is divided in 3 main sections. First, what is? And that has to do with the person of Christ, as he is in the glory, as he also walks among the candlestick. What he has seen, that was this vision of Christ in chapter 1. And then what is? The things which are, we have seen in chapter 2 and 3, the history of the church. And we are still there as far as the historical development is concerned. We are still in chapter 2 and 3. But as we have expressed in our prayer, we have the privilege to look ahead. And we have seen already in chapter 4 this call. We have heard this call, come up hither. And there we have followed John. He was in heaven. He saw the thrones. He saw the Lamb on the throne, chapter 5. He saw the book with the 7 seals. And we have seen the 7 seal judgments of the beginning of the week, as we call Daniel's 70th week. And then we have seen the 7 trumpets, which started around the beginning of the Great Tribulation. And then, in chapter 16, the last time, we have seen these judgments at the end of the Great Tribulation. So this book is a book of judgment. And nevertheless, there are many, many blessings for the believer. Now, just to make the connection, very briefly, the connection literally and the connection in your mind, we have seen this bowl judgment in chapter 16. The word bowl really means dish. It's the other word used in the King James might give you a different idea of a bottle or something like that. But it's really a dish. And these dishes will be poured out in rapid succession, very rapidly. And so God's final judgment, and this is the wrath of God, really the 7 dishes have to do with the wrath of God, will be poured out at the end of what we call the Great Tribulation in rapid succession. And then, so we have seen these bowl judgments, and usually after the 6th judgment there is a parenthesis, and we have seen the parenthesis in chapter 16 verse 13, how God is working behind the scenes. The enemy works, a trinity of evil forces we have seen, but behind this trinity of evil forces, the dragon, the beast, that is the first beast, and the false prophet, or the second beast, behind these evil forces, God is working. And we have seen in chapter 16 verse 16, He gathered them. God is in control. So then we come to the 7th bowl. We have seen that in the end of chapter 16, we have seen the fall of the great city, which is Rome, in verse 19. And then, because of the fall of Rome, all the cities of the nations, chapter 16, verse 19, and great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fury of His wrath. Now please turn back with me to chapter 14. If you remember, when we studied chapter 14, we had 7 scenes in connection with the Great Tribulation, not necessarily taking place during the Great Tribulation, but related to the Great Tribulation. And there we have seen in chapter 14, verse 8, a second angel followed, saying, Great Babylon has fallen, which of the wine of the fury of her fornication has made all nations drink. Now what we have tonight is a chapter giving much more detail about this judgment, which was not taking place there in chapter 14, verse 8. It was announced there. But in chapter 16, verse 19b, at the end of verse 19, there we have God's judgment over great Babylon. Okay, so it's all distinguished. On the one hand, this great city, which is Rome, the political unity, the headquarters of the Roman Empire, put it that way. That is chapter 16, verse 19 at the beginning. It has an effect on all the cities of the nations, but then also, besides that, great Babylon was remembered before God. So here you have this dish, or this bowl judgment, the 7th bowl, which is definite. And as we have seen in chapter 11, verse 15 already, then the wrath of God would be completed, accomplished, and then the millennial reign would be established. And so you have to link this immediately with chapter 19 then. Okay, so you see here now the 7th bowl judgment, and then a parenthesis. And we hope to see in chapter 17, I'll come back to that, great Babylon seen as a woman. In chapter 18, great Babylon seen as a city. And then we have another scene, part of this parenthesis, which is then the true bride in heaven. But we have to keep that for another time. But then this parenthesis closes at chapter 19, verse 10. And at chapter 19, verse 11, we have the historical continuation. So we have to keep that in mind. Chapter 16, verse 19, there we have the last bowl judgment. And so the wrath of God is completed, according to chapter 11 also. But then the wrath of the Lamb will still take place. Remember when the seal judgment the 6th seal judgment, people said the wrath of the Lamb is come. It was not come yet. The wrath of God was not even come yet in connection with the seal judgment. But they understood somehow God was working. But the wrath of the Lamb really starts in chapter 19, verse 11, when the heavens will be opened, and there we have the armies, the heavenly armies coming down with Him. And then the beast, the leader of the Roman Empire and his armies, and the false prophet will be judged and cast into the lake of fire. So that is the wrath of the Lamb. And then, only then, He will also take care of the king of the north later on, and then the armies of the northern armies, which will attack Israel after that, according to Ezekiel 38 and 39. That is all to follow after these events we have seen in chapter 16. But of course there is a connection. I just wanted to remind you of this. When the 6th bowl is poured out, the great river Euphrates dried out. And so then we have seen that in connection with that, the way is opened for the king of the north to attack Israel and Egypt later on. And that will be the occasion then that these armies of the Roman Empire, under the leadership of the dragon and the beast and the false prophet, will unite themselves and will go to Armageddon. And so that is what we have seen in chapter 16, verse 16. But then you have to make the jump to chapter 19, verse 11, to see the historical order then. Chapter 16, verse 16 is followed up in chapter 19, verse 11 and following. And in between we have much information about Babylon. And that's where we are now, these parentheses again. You remember, after the seventh also, after the seventh judgment, there is always a parenthesis giving more information. And so we have all these, you've seen the last time these three signs in heaven. You've seen the seven prominent persons. The woman there, in chapter 12, was Israel and the remnant. I'll come back to that in a moment. There are four women in the book of Revelation. Then you have the dragon, Satan. We have seen the male child, Christ. We have seen the archangel Michael for Israel. But special emphasis we have seen in chapter 13, the beast out of the sea, and then the beast out of the earth. And then also we have mentioned already then, one of the key players is this great Babylon. And only here we have more information about this key player, Babylon, and the connection with the other beast. So this is a very important chapter, very helpful. And I found an illustration, I think I've showed it when we were in chapter 13, how in our days, even an artist's conception of this idea, also in the old literature it was known that a woman would ride on a beast. That is a concept which is known also in pagan literature. But here we find it in the Bible. And this is not a Christian artist who made it. This is a stamp issued in connection with the second election of the European Parliament. So when even the unbelievers do something like this, you might see there is a connection with the things which are happening today. But it is not a fulfillment yet, of course. That is where we have to be very careful. Just this. So now when we would turn back to chapter 17, I again want to make the link with chapter 16. We have found 10 great things in chapter 16. That's amazing. It's a chapter of great things, a great voice, and so on. Now in chapter 17 and 18 we have, as I said, a parenthesis giving more information about Babylon. And also there we find many times the word great harlot. It's in connection with these great powers. Great riches, great Babylon, the great city. John was taken with great wonder in connection with all these things going on. He was taken with great wonder. Many great things. And at the end of chapter 18 also we find a great millstone. And in chapter 19 a great multitude in heaven. So again, many great things. And that helps us also when we make the connection with great things in the past. Because what I would like to show you, there is a link with the things which happened in the past. In a moment I'd like to turn back to Genesis, and there we have also great things. We have the giants from before the flood. We have the great man like Nimrod, who was a great hunter before the Lord. Great things. And these great things are all connected somehow. And contrast this, again, with the Lamb. We hope to see in chapter 19 the marriage feast of the Lamb. The one who takes it up against these great persons, these great armies, is the Lamb. And the word in the Greek used there is diminutive, a little lamb. Almost said in a despising way, just a little lamb. But he is our Lord who will take it up against all these great powers. I want you to notice that many times it says of this woman that she sits. She is at ease, in a sense. We are living in this world, and the believers are only seen as seated in the heavenlies, seated in heavenly places. There we will be at ease. But here on this earth we are on the go. We are pilgrims. And this character, this pilgrim character, is entirely denied by this woman who sits and is at ease in this world where Christ is rejected. We see that in verse 1, she sits upon many waters. In verse 3, she sits upon a scarlet beast. And in verse 9, she sits upon 7 mountains. So we hope to see there, it's not only a matter of being at ease, it's also a matter of imposing herself, taking control of things, and ruling. Now, we are invited, as John was invited, to come here to see the things from God's perspective. That's always very important, to learn to see the things from God's perspective. So let us follow this call and also go up, as it were, and see the things from God's perspective. And I'd like to compare this invitation with chapter 19, if you can, in chapter 21, where we have another invitation in verse 9. Come here, I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife. There are great contrasts in these chapters. Here we have in chapter 17 and 18, the false bride, the false city. Here in chapter 21 we have the true bride, the Lamb's wife, as we hope to see her also in chapter 19. Then we have the holy city, or the New Jerusalem even in connection with the eternal state, or the Jerusalem from on high, having the glory of God. There are great contrasts in these chapters. And taken on a mountain here in verse 10, a great and high mountain. Whereas in chapter 17, John was carried away in spirit to a desert. We'll come back to that in a moment. So now it says here, I will show thee the sentence of the great harlot who sits upon many waters. As I said, there are 4 women mentioned in the book of Revelation. The first is mentioned in chapter 2. We have seen her, Jezebel. And Jezebel, of course, links immediately with the Old Testament Jezebel, Ahab's wife. But then we also should make the connection with Genesis 10 and 11. Because Jezebel, her father, was a priest, or the high priest in Sidon, and he represented the Baal worship. And the Baal worship came from Babel. And so what is the real origin of what we have seen in Romans 2, this Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, but she teaches and leads astray my servants to commit fornication and eat of idol sacrifices. The origin of this goes way back, also really in history. And I want you to notice that perhaps it would be good to just turn back to Genesis and then follow this a little bit. The book of Genesis is the book of origins. It's very helpful to see an initial thought given in the book of Genesis and then following that thought through the scriptures. That is very helpful. And first of all, in Genesis 3, of course, we have Satan's alternative for God's order. Satan's lies there. We cannot speak about that, but there is a connection, of course. What Satan introduces in Babel is a counterfeit. God wants to have his king. Satan introduces a counterfeit. So it is with religion. In Genesis 4, we see Satan's counterfeit in Cain and his religion, man after the religion of man after the flesh, the culture which is established then in Genesis 4, man after the flesh, independent upon God. That is the original roots. But then, when you go to chapter 10, after the flood, you find an additional element added to it. There we find, really, the introduction of idolatry. And in Genesis 10, it says in verse 8 about Nimrod. Nimrod, his name means rebel. Literally, it is connected with a word that means going down. And the word Nimrod is translated with rebel. It says in verse 8 there, Genesis 10, he began to be mighty on the earth. So there you have a great man on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Jehovah. See the contrast with God's idea of a king. God's idea of a king is a shepherd king. Daniel and David, you find God's ideal of a king. God has a shepherd. But Nimrod is Satan's man, as it were. He's a hunter. Not only before Jehovah, also against Jehovah. He's not only a hunter of animals. He was controlling people. And in Revelation 18, we hope to see how also the souls of man were found in this great Babylon. A hunter of man also. Controlling, manipulating people. That is what was going on already in those days. His competition was really with God, against God. He is a very able man, but he imitates God. It is 3 times mighty, almost an imitation of the Trinity. And then it says in verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. I want you to notice that. The beginning of his kingdom. So we have a first king here on this earth with great pretensions, great abilities also. But he is a rebel. He is somebody who would stand up against God, a mighty man, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now, Babel really means gate to God. And that's what we find in chapter 11, just in a moment. And it says also in the land of Shinar. See? And I want to come back to that expression too in just a moment. Now, when you would turn to chapter 11, you find the corruption. Nimrod was a very violent man. There you have the aspect of violence. As you know, sin is characterized by 2 things, violence and corruption. It was before the flood, it's also here after the flood. And so here in Genesis 11 you have a picture which helps us to understand the true character of Babylon. In those days, of course, it was connected with the starting point of the nations. From there, God scattered them all over the world. And they took their idolatry with them all over the world. It started here. Here, idolatry started. Now, you say, where do you find idolatry? You don't find the word literally here in Genesis 11. But if you read the whole chapter, you see it right before you. First of all, there is this emphasis on unity in verse 2. One language, verse 1. God had given this one language, so there was nothing wrong with that yet. But they stayed in one plane together, whereas God had said that they should fill the earth. So there was disobedience again. In verse 3, you see their pretensions. Come on, let us make bricks. Many times you find let us. This is formation according to man's ideas. This is not God's idea. God works with stones. But this is bricks made from asphalt, as it says, from mortar. And the bricks were really made from the dust of the earth. So under God's curse, from a cursed earth. That is what they used for their city. It cannot be blessed by God. As God could not bless Cain's sacrifice, so God cannot bless this enterprise either. So this is the wrong material, the wrong method. It's all for self-glorification, and there's where idolatry comes in, you know. Come on, let us build ourselves a city. That is really the bottom line of idolatry. Doing things for yourself, doing your own thing. That is idolatry already, in principle. But when you read carefully verse 4, and a tower, the top of which may reach the heavens, to the heavens. They would build a platform on the tower as an observatory. They were good in astrology, but then they linked this the good scientific methods they had, they linked it with a wrong philosophy, as we know, astrology. So they had astronomy, but they linked it with astrology. They interpreted these things, and what really was the purpose? To have a contact with the invisible world. On top of this platform was a temple, and in this temple there were crystals, and these crystals would make the connection with the invisible world. And there's where idolatry comes in. The demon powers with whom they were in contact would teach them and introduce idolatry. God did not allow the fallen angels to link themselves in a bodily way with these men, as he did in Genesis 6. But here, there is a spiritual link between the fallen angels, the demons. And their gate to heaven is not God's world, it is Satan's world. The gate to heaven for them is really being in touch with the invisible world, which is controlled by demons. Not to have a relationship with the true and living God. That was not their purpose. Their purpose was this pantheist concept where we see that everything is God and God is everything, and getting to a higher hierarchy and having these contacts with these invisible forces. That was really their purpose. And Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, she introduced this idolatry. According to what we know, it says that after Nimrod's death, she had a child in a miraculous way, and also the concept of resurrection there is already introduced. And this woman with the baby is really the same idea you find later on in the Roman Catholic Church with Mary and the baby. But now my point, what is stopped here by God when He scattered them over the face of the whole earth, these elements of idolatry are taken with these nations all over the world. And then when you would read in Genesis 12, then you see how God would take one man out of such a context of idolatry to have him for himself as a true witness. And so the church would be a true witness for God, but has been corrupted. As Abraham's descendants have been corrupted by the same kind of idolatry. That is very striking. This type of idolatry literally was transported then, like I said earlier, Jezebel's father was involved in the same type of idolatry, Baal and Astarte. In Ezekiel you find Tammuz, that was the little baby then on the mother's arm. This was then also introduced in Israel in the days of the prophets. Jeremiah refers to the Queen of Heaven. And then later on when Babel, the Babylonian Empire fell, and there of course you find also idolatry. In Daniel 3 you find the statue there. I mean, we cannot speak about all these details, but you know them. See the connection. When this empire was set aside by the Medo-Persians, then they transported some of these services to Pergamos. And we have seen in Revelation 2, in Pergamos, that the Lord says, there where Satan dwells. It was Satan's dwelling place in a very special way. This source of idolatry, which was introduced here in Genesis 10 and 11, was then transported to the kingdom of Pergamos, and later on taken over by Rome, and then brought to Rome. And there is where we have this same idolatry in Rome. And the Roman emperor was the pontifex, the high priest of all these religions. He was himself seen as a god. He was also a kind of a high priest, and all these religions were under his control. That was the Roman emperor. But what happened in history, the Roman Catholic Church took all these elements and christened them a little bit, covered them a little bit here, covered them a little bit there, and the Pope became the Pontifex Maximus. He became the high priest. And all these elements are still there today in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, when we speak about the Roman Catholic Church, it's not to speak against persons who are there. We should love, especially those who are born again, in this system. But we are speaking about this idolatrous system, which has elements in itself which go back to these days, as we find here in Genesis 10 and 11. And we see the impact of this idolatry on Israel, that God even had to say, now I'll bring you back to the source where it comes from. When you read Zechariah 5, you see there a woman covered or inside the ephah, and then there's a lead cover over her, on top of her. And then this is transported back to Shinar. Therefore I said we come back to Shinar. When you read Zechariah 5, you see how this is brought back to Shinar. And as this source of idolatry came from the land of Shinar, from Babel, which also means confusion, as we find in Genesis 11, so Israel was brought back, or the two tribes were brought back to the source of idolatry. There they were in the Babylonian captivity. And then a little remnant was saved from there in the days of before Ezra already. It was 80 years before Ezra, and then under Ezra and Nehemiah also. A remnant came back to Jerusalem. And I will come back to that point in in Revelation 18, when we see this verse, my people go out of her. So we will come back to that next time. But today we speak now about this idolatrous system and its impact on God's people. As I said, Abram was called out of idolatry to be a true and living witness for the living God. His descendants were corrupted by this idolatry. And the same happened in the history of the church. And we have seen that in Jezebel and Revelation 2. So now we are back to the book of Revelation. And the first woman mentioned there is Jezebel. And I think she is very intimately connected with Revelation 17 and 18, the Great Babylon. But not exactly the same. I think the Great Babylon, as we hope to see, we see, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, but controlling much more than only her followers, those who are immediately in the Roman Catholic Church. We have seen in Revelation 3 there is a distinction between Thyatira and Sardis. Sardis will also be there when the Lord will come. But we see here the influence of this system over the whole world. And that is why, in a sense, the whole Christian profession after the rapture will be seen here in this woman. But we have to follow the order of the book, of the chapter, and then certain things will become more and more clear for us. But I made this little excursion because it's good for us to understand the connection with the past and how the same elements come back and are judged here definitely by God. Now, when we speak about a harlot, we understand that God's concept is marriage. And it's very interesting that Satan's counterfeit starts always after God's plans. God had a plan. In Genesis 2, we see it already. One man, one woman. And Satan wants to corrupt this. Also, as far as the church is concerned, we see that the church is seen as a bride already in God's plans long before Satan's counterfeit is seen. The same is with the city. In Hebrews, we see the city, and also in Revelation, we hope to see the New Jerusalem, that was in God's mind before the foundation of the world already, because there we speak about the new creation. And so Satan has his counterfeit, as we hope to see in chapter 18, the great city. So Satan is always counterfeiting God. That is an important point. And so he has his counterfeit here. But the second, it's not only a counterfeit, it's also a corruption. What was God's plan for the church is entirely corrupted here in the harlot. And what is her real characteristic? That is what we find in the verses later on, what she does. Her connection with this world. Where Christ has been crucified, where she should be a pilgrim, as I said earlier, or a widow, she should be separated from this world, where Christ has been crucified, she connects herself with this world. That is really the bottom line. So it is a pseudo-religious system. And In chapter 17 we have the religious aspect, chapter 18 we have the political aspect and the economic aspect. The religious aspect is connected with a woman. I mentioned already this woman in Zechariah 5. The woman often in Scripture represents a system. Israel also is represented by a woman. Now I come back to another woman in the book of Revelation. We have seen Israel and the remnant in Revelation 12. So we had Jezebel. There was still a remnant in the days of Thyatira. Here we see no remnant left because the true believers are in heaven. Here we have the apostate church. But there is a connection between Jezebel in Revelation 2 and Babylon here. But then we have seen Israel, the woman in Revelation 12, is a different, an entirely different concept, but also a woman. As I said, often God takes a woman as an illustration or a type of a system or concept. And often in connection with religion, a religious concept, and also connected with love. As Israel was supposed to love God, so the church was supposed to love Christ and be dedicated to Christ. And instead, Israel has become a prostitute. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, you find it, many other places, Hosea. And so the church has become a prostitute. How terrible. Now you would say, well, that's far from my bed. But now for us is to meditate upon these things and see how we can be easily under the influence of these things, as we hope to see now in the next verses. Using things for ourselves is already idolatry and is unfaithfulness towards Christ. Now we see here in verse 1 on the many waters, and that is explained later on in verse 15 what that is, peoples and multitudes and nations. I'll just mention these few points very briefly. In verse 4 we see she is clothed in purple and scarlet. So there we have her outward glories. In verse 6, we find her drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. There we have the persecution. It's a system which persecutes. So it's a system full of glory outwardly in verse 4, 3 and 4. It's a system which persecutes. And then in verse 9, we see it's also dominating. It's seated on the mountains, the 7 mountains. We'll come back to that, but I just mentioned this now. So that shows political influence, religious influence, but also political influence at the same time. And then we have in verse 15 that she sits on peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. There we have a great influence worldwide, not only in Rome, on the city of Rome in verse 9, or a political system, but worldwide. And then in verse 18 we see it is the great city. So the woman is also the great city, which has kingship over the kings of the earth. And in chapter 18 we will see other aspects also. The demonic influences there. Idolatry is always linked with demonic influences. And her unrighteousness, and her sorcery. All these things we'll deal with later on. Now when we go to verse 2 now, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. The expression kings of the earth we find many times. Sometimes it is referred to the 10 kings of the Roman Empire, as was the case in chapter 16, verse 14. For they are the spirits of demons doing signs which go out to the kings of the whole habitable world. There the whole habitable world is the Roman Empire, the Roman world, the oikumene, the world under the control, the immediate control of the Roman Empire. But sometimes the kings of the earth is also a wider thought. All the kings of the different nations, not only under the immediate control of the Roman Empire, but also outside of it. And so here in this chapter we see that the woman has an influence in both domains, but we'll see the details later on. With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. Now we see that God's idea of the church was that she should be a chaste virgin, 2 Corinthians 11, that she would keep herself for her bridegroom. We've seen it in Revelation 2 already. First love forsaken. That is where the deviation started. Here we see the full result of this deviation. Another verse which comes to mind, 1 Corinthians 4. The Corinthians wanted already to rule in those days. Even when Paul wrote that letter, he said, you wanted to rule already now. You are a dispensation too early. We will rule when Christ will come out of the heavens, Revelation 19, and the armies, heavenly armies following him. That's the time to rule. But now it's a time to suffer. Romans 8 says, if we suffer with him now, he will glorify us. In 2 Timothy 2 also is a reference to being faithful now and suffer now, and then he will recompense us later on. So it's a time of suffering. During the absence of the true bridegroom, the true king, there is suffering instead of ruling. And this link, this fornication, is really a link with this world system where Christ is rejected. An emotional or affectionate link. The affections are involved. And that is why there is idolatry at the same time. We have seen that with Jezebel already in Revelation 2, that this fornication, this spiritual fornication, this link with the world, introduces at the same time the idea of idolatry. Always goes together. And later on we find also the abominations in verse 4. The abominations refers to idolatry. It's always the case in the Bible. Abomination refers to idolatry. So you have both elements together. Now it says in verse 2, that they that dwell on the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So here you have the intoxicating effect of this influence. It's very interesting to compare with Jeremiah 50 and 51. We cannot do that all the time, also with Isaiah and other scriptures, but there are very striking parallels between Jeremiah 50 and 51, where Jeremiah speaks about Babylon of his days, which has been destroyed in the meantime, and this Babylon system we are speaking about now in Revelation 17. There are striking parallels. And one of the parallels is in 51 verse 7, where he says, Babylon has been a golden cup in Jehovah's hand that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunk of her wine, therefore have the nations become mad. Here we find the influence of idolatry having an effect on all the nations, but at the same time this is under God's government, God's dealings. What she has done is, to put it in two words, it's a system of sight. They that dwell on the earth have been made drunk. We have seen in this book, I mentioned it earlier, I don't know when exactly, but we have mentioned that the kings of the earth, or those that dwell on the earth, are those who are in the context of the Christian profession, the outward Christian profession, but entirely ruled by man's appetites, man's desires. It is a religion for the heart of man. And what we find here in this chapter is a religion for the heart of man, not for God and for His glory, but for the natural man on this earth, who finds his dwelling place here, who does not think about heaven, but only for this earth and for this world. And in this system, therefore, we have also a man-made succession. Everything is organized according to man's ideas. And so, we find here that they have been drunk with the wine of her fornication. She has an influence which goes even beyond the borders of her own system, as I said earlier. Now, when we follow the chapter here, in verse 3, He carried me away in spirit to a desert. Contrast this with the mountain, the high mountain the apostle saw when he saw the true church in Revelation 21. In a desert there is no comfort, there is no refreshment, there is no spiritual food, there is death. This is a scene of moral death, what is presented before our eyes. There is nothing for God. Everything of God is used for itself, and therefore there is nothing for God. So there is everything for natural man, everything is for self, there is nothing for God, and therefore it is spiritual death. I saw a woman sitting upon a scarlet beast. She is in control. Now the scarlet beast we will find in a few verses later on. I just want to mention here the connection. She herself was clothed with purple and scarlet, according to verse 4. And the scarlet is the color used for kings. In chapter 17, at the end, we have seen she is the great city which has kingship over the kings of the earth. It's a royal color. And the purple is an imperial color. Dictators would use a religious system for their own purposes. And so this beast, the scarlet beast, will use this woman for a certain time for his own purposes. Now we have in verse 4 how she is clothed not only in scarlet and purple, but also had ornaments of gold. See this. Instead of seeking the glory of God, she wanted to have the glory of God for herself. Contrast this with the other woman we find in this book, the fourth one, the bride of Christ. When she will appear from heaven, it says, having the glory of God. This is God's idea to give gold. But instead of claiming it, the woman claims everything for herself. To the true bride, God will give His glory. The glory of God will be seen in the bride of Christ. The precious stones will be seen there. 1 Corinthians 3 shows that we are all precious stones. The true believers are precious stones. But here the woman claims everything for herself. The different glories of God seen in the precious stones, it's all for her. for her ambition, for her glory. The pearls, we will see the pearls in connection with the church. Here it is for the apostle church. So there is a real competition going on. It's not only a counterfeit, it's also competition and imitation. And this element of imitation is very strong also in our days. 2 Timothy 3, for example, speaks about wise men who imitated Moses. And so in a similar way, it's in our days, this imitation of God's power and God's miracles is taking place also in our days. And that will go on also after the rapture of the church, this imitation. And having a golden cup in her hand. We know a cup. God has given the cup of deliverance to the Lord Jesus. He shares all the blessings through this cup with us. Here is a golden cup, which is again a counterfeit, an imitation. And it is filled not with God's blessings, it's filled with abominations. This is really the cup of idolatry. And we have to, if you read the word abomination in the book of Daniel, you see immediately how it's connected with idolatry. And many other passages would confirm this. We see idolatry not only in the statutes which people worship. See it in Mary, who's worshipped. I said that really comes back from this concept of the woman with the baby on her arm. We see the worship of Mary, we see the worship of the saints, but also in different ways the idolatry is introduced in the church today, already today, and so it will become worse. Yoga, for example, is a religious concept, but taken from one of the world religions. And it is very striking for us today how the Pope has the leadership and over many, many world religions now, how they would all somehow listen to the Pope and accept his leadership. But it is an amalgamation, and it is a mixture of all kinds of idolatries, and God would call it abominations. And also the unclean things of her fornication. So we have seen idolatry, fornication, these two go together. And then verse 5, upon her forehead a name written, mystery. It represents what she really is. In Ephesians 5 we see the mystery in connection with the church, linked with Christ in heaven. Here the mystery is Babylon, the mother of the harlots. She is, we have seen the sources in Genesis 10 and 11 already. She is the sum total of this religious, idolatrous power. She is the source of it, because she has also daughters. She is the mother of the harlots. Now, if the Roman Catholic Church is the harlot, who are her daughters? And we see today also other churches, and more or less under the influence of this system. But as I say, also other so-called world religions are now incorporated in this system, as also happened in the past, how pagan religions were introduced and into the church. It's a mixture of all these different forms of idolatry and the abominations of the earth. Now, I want you to understand that this idolatry is immediately linked also with what we have in chapter 18, the habitation of demons and unclean spirits, because idolatry is immediately linked with demon worship, as Deuteronomy 32 shows and 1 Corinthians 10, and also in chapter 18, verse 23, sorcery. She uses sorcery, and sorcery is really active involvement in occult powers. So it's all linked together. You have to know really both chapters very carefully in order to see the whole picture. So in a sense it is a mystery, but it is a revealed mystery. And we have one of the sheets which we had earlier, the different mysteries in the Bible, which were unknown in the past, revealed to God's people. And so here this mystery now is made known to us, what the real situation is. What is striking to me is to see that there is also a link with the book of Daniel, but we may come back to that later on. Verse 6, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints. There we have this element of persecution. There is no freedom in this system. Sometimes we will have the form of religious liberty and freedom, but only when it fits her purposes. But another thing, what we find here in verse 6, the blood of the saints was found, and the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. So that might be a suggestion that even after the rapture, when there will be persecution, the church will be involved in this. We have seen the souls under the altar in Revelation 6, and there might be a connection there, that even in that day there is still persecution. And we can understand that when we see, on the one hand, the so-called tolerance for every form of religion, but the intolerance towards those who would make a stand for God. There is absolute intolerance then. And so persecution will be the next step. Then we come to verse At the end of verse 6, I wondered, seeing her with great wonder. Contrast this when John sees the church in her glory, in the future state, in chapter 21, he is also taken with amazement. But what a contrast. Here, he wondered because of the worldly form of the church. How could that be? And how would this have touched his heart, the one who had rested on the bosom of Christ, to see now how his church would become such a corrupt system. Of course, we are not speaking about the true believers. They will be in heaven. And today, it's a mixture. There are true believers even in a system like that. But then will be absolutely only unbelievers in those days who will be part of that system. Verse 7, why hast thou wondered? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and the beast which carries her. So first we have the mystery of the woman. And again, I emphasize this is after the rapture. It's not the days of Jezebel when there was still a remnant. Verse 8, the beast which thou sawest. So now first we have an explanation of the beast. Then we have an explanation of the heads in verse 9 to 11. The 7 heads. Then we have an explanation of the 10 horns, verses 12 to 14. An explanation of the waters in verse 15. And an explanation of the woman in verse 18. So that's the order of the explanation. So you see again, to explain the woman, what the woman is, he has to mention other things at the same time to explain. So first we have now the beast, the 7 heads and the 10 horns. We've seen it in Revelation 13, so I don't have to explain that again. We've seen the link there with the past, with the book of Daniel, Daniel 2, Daniel 7. We have seen there how there is also the link with the dragon. And therefore it says here in verse 8, come up out of the abyss. So just these 4 points. The beast which thou sawest was, number 1, and is not. Well, many have a difficulty with this to understand, because the moment that John wrote, the Roman Empire was there. The Caesar Domitian was there. So how can it say, and is not? Because this is prophetic language. The prophet sees here then, according to these instructions, the beast that was there at those days, but which would disappear. In the year 476, it disappeared. Of course, certain elements continued. As I said, they were taken over by the Roman Catholic Church and by West European nations. But the empire as such stopped. And therefore, this prophetic note here is not. At that time, it was there, but prophetically seen, it was not, would not be. And then, the third phase is about to come up. And that's a new element. We have seen in chapter 13, it would come up out of the waters, of the seas, of the nations. But here it says it would come up out of the abyss. Here it shows its moral origins. It was really linked with Satan himself. We have seen in Revelation 9 how in the Great Tribulation these demonic influences would go out in connection with the Antichrist. And here we see the moral origins of this empire right from the abyss. And therefore, here you find the character as it will have when Satan will be cast out of heaven, the dragon will be on the earth, and he will invade, as were the personalities of the leader of the Roman Empire and the Antichrist. That is why it says here, come up out of the abyss. That is the origin, comes from Satan himself. And then the destination, and it goes into destruction. So it was, is not, in our days it's still not. It is to come out of the abyss, and then it goes into destruction. And they who dwell on the earth, again this expression, they who dwell on the earth, think of 2 Thessalonians 2, the people who will be under strong delusion. There it is in the Antichrist. Here is delusion under the influence of the Roman emperor, and also of the woman. Not written from the founding of the world in the book of life, shall wander, seeing the beast that it was and is not, and shall be present. Again, the idea of imitation of resurrection, as it was with this woman I mentioned from Babylon. The idea of resurrection was already there with her son Tammuz. Here you have the same idea of resurrection, and somehow the enemy will use that concept of resurrection and say, there he is, and they will follow him. That is the energy of error, which we have in 2 Thessalonians 2, in connection with the Antichrist, and here the energy of error to accept the leader of the Roman Empire, and then it will be back. That is one thing. Now the second point, which is explained now, is the 7 heads, verse 9. Here is the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains, whereon the woman sits. So again, you have to see, many of the details were known already. The Roman Empire the headquarters were in Rome, the city of the 7 mountains or the 7 hills. But here we see also the connection with the woman now. The woman has their control. So it's not only the Roman Empire and its headquarters, but also now the influence of the woman on this, what is explained in this chapter. Then verse 10, and there are 7 kings. So the meaning of the 7 mountains is a geographical indication, the city of Rome, but it is also 7 consecutive forms of government. That is a historic order. It's, as it were, figurative language. These 7 mountains represent also 7 kings, verse 10. And it's given in an order because it says in verse 11, the 8th, that indicates an order. The first, the second, the third, and so on, till the 8th. That is an order, succession, consecutive order. Whereas the 10 kings, we find in connection with the 10 horns from verse 12 to 14, they will rule simultaneously at the same time. But therefore, we have to read very carefully here. So, the 7 mountains, geographic reality, the city of Rome, but then represent also form of governments, as it was the case with Rome. Rome in those days, it says now in verse 10, 5 have fallen. And so, these different forms of government were past tense, 5 of them. One is, that is, in those days when John wrote, was the 6th form, the imperial form. The other has not yet come. We have seen that the coming phase of the kingdom is still to come, and so the coming leader, the coming form of government is still to come. That is, the 7th form is not yet come. And then, when he comes, he must remain only a little while. Now, the 7th form, my suggestion is, will only take place after the rapture. We may even see the Roman Empire coming back in its 6th form, in its imperial form. But then, the 7th form will be there the moment that the treaty will be signed between Israel and the leader of the Roman Empire. We have seen it in Daniel 9, the prince of the nation of the coming prince, there in Daniel 9. So this coming prince would be the 7th form also of this empire, and under that form they would sign this treaty with Israel. But then there will be a radical change in the middle of the week. And that is very remarkable, and that is why I said I come back to the book of Daniel, because we see in this chapter there will be a change of attitude towards the woman. And so, when there will be a change of attitude towards Israel in the middle of the week, when the sacrifice will be stopped in the temple, and so there will be a change of attitude also towards the woman. That is why I said there is a link here with the book of Daniel. It must remain a little while. So perhaps we can even include the first half of Daniel's week there, but there are many details we are not really absolutely sure about. Verse 11, the beast that was and is not, he is also an 8th. So there you see sometimes the beast represents the whole empire, sometimes it speaks of the leader. And so the leader is seen here as the 8th. So this form, the 6th form will come back, the 7th form we will have, and then out of that form will come a new form, and that's the 8th. And I think that is in connection with the moment that Satan will be cast out of heaven, and the dragon will invade him. And that will be the 8th form. That's a new form, which was unknown. And that is also the connection which we have in verse 8, out of the abyss. This new form is of the 7 and goes into destruction. Again, this is emphasized. Now verse 12, there are more details now about the horns. So there again, you have a different part of the image. The 10 horns which thou sawest, and when it is said which thou sawest, it speaks about another detail. There's a new detail. It was not what people in the past tried to do by imitation, like Charlemagne or Karl V or Napoleon or Hitler. They imitated this. But what is still in the future day is that these 10 kings will put themselves together, and they have not received a kingdom yet, it says here, but receive authority as kings 1 hour with the beast. So that is under God's providence, God's dealing with man, He will allow them to rule 1 hour with the beast. So together with these 7th and 8th. By the way, in Daniel 7 you have a few more details. When the 8th form will start, he will humiliate 3 of the horns. There you have 10 horns, and then you have a little horn, that is the 8th form here. The time he will humiliate 3 of them. That is a detail we don't find here. In verse 13 it says, these have one mind, and give their power and authority to the beast. So this is very remarkable. In the history past, they tried to rebuild this empire by force, by wars, and so on. It never succeeded. And the moment will come that there will be a movement, maybe because of economic reasons and political reasons, but there will be a voluntary movement to put things together, and here we have the indication already of this. One mind, and they give their power and authority to the beast. So then they hand over part of their own authority to the beast. And that is a tendency which we see already today in Europe, the preparation for this. Now notice another point, and that's very important. Behind the scenes, God is working. Verse 14, these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. The moment is not there yet. And the purpose probably is not there too. But God shows here what's going on behind the scenes. The ultimate purpose is, it's war against the Lamb. And therefore I said, over against these great powers, we see the little lamb. So you have to connect this again with Revelation 19, when the Lord will come out of heaven, verse 11 of chapter 19. He is Lord of Lords. Contrast with the lordship the church claimed for itself, the lordship of the Roman emperor and the 10 kings. What a contrast. He is the true Lord. He is the true king. And notice, he is not ashamed to have people with him. He would be ashamed of this false church, but they that are with him. Tonight we ask this question ourselves. Am I with him? Are you with the Lord of Lords? Are you with the King of Kings? Then you can't be with the false church. You can't be with the ruler there. It's either with this false church and her control and influence, or with the true Lord and the true King. And they that are with him, called. They are called ones. Think of Abram again, Genesis 12. He was called out of this corrupt system. So we have been called out of it. Chosen. We are chosen for God. The woman chose everything for herself. And then faithful. Despite persecution. Despite hardships. Faithful in time. These three elements are mentioned here of true saints, for whom the Lord will not be ashamed. Now we have some more details in verse 15. The waters which thou sawest, where the harlot sits, are peoples and multitudes, and nations and tongues. And therefore I said, the influence the woman has even surpasses the Roman Empire. It's not only Rome, the city of Rome, it's not only the Roman Empire, but even the nations as such. And we know that the Roman Catholic Church today already has a great influence in Asia, in even South America, and these are parts of the world which have nothing to do with the Roman Empire. Verse 16, the 10 horns which thou sawest, and the beast, these shall hate the harlot. Now, that is what I link again with Daniel 9. The moment this treaty will be broken, half of the week there will be a change of heart, and they will stop the sacrifice in the temple. And 2 Thessalonians 2, we see that the Antichrist will place himself in the temple, declaring himself to be God. We have spoken about that in connection with Revelation 13, the false prophet. Now here, in those days, we don't know exactly when, but during the Great Tribulation, this will be fulfilled. The Roman Empire will also hate the woman. As I said, the dictator will allow the woman and its influence for a long time. And we see it today. They would benefit from that influence for their own purposes, as long as it fits their purposes. But now, the emperor will show his true character. And even what reminds in the church, even the apostate church, there will be reminders of the true God. Even that he would get rid of. So here we see that he will get rid of the religious power of the woman. And therefore, I think there's a link with Daniel 9, because there they want to get rid of the religious influence of the Jews, the religious influence of the faithful Jews there in the temple, and somehow there is a link there. But now 5 things I just want to underline. They shall hate the harlot. They shall make her desolate, that is, despoiled. She will lose all this influence. All this gold and silver and precious stones and all these things will be gone. Disgraced, naked, and shall eat her flesh. They devour her. So everything which she wanted to have for herself is now gone, and the others will take care of that. And fifthly, shall burn her with fire. So the woman here, seen as a religious system, will be destroyed, entirely destroyed. As it was the case in the Old Testament, literally burned. So here, in a moral sense, we see that applied. She will be burned. The harlot will be burned. And that is why God is behind the scenes. God uses these kings, as it says in verse 17. God has given to their hearts to do His mind. We have seen the same thing in chapter 16, verse 16. He gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon. God will send the armies of the Roman Empire there. And so He will send the 10 kings to do His mind, to destroy the woman, this religious system. And therefore, we don't know exactly when this will take place during the Great Tribulation. But we have to see the difference between the religious aspect in Revelation 17 and the political, economic, social structure we find in chapter 18, which we will discuss the next time. It will not be judged at the same time, because chapter 18 is the great Babylon, the great city, which will be destroyed at the end, as we've seen in Revelation 16. The wrath of God will be finished with that at the end of the Great Tribulation. That will take place. So we don't know exactly how much time there will be in between. I don't know. Some suggest that it will take place at the beginning of the Great Tribulation, like also the covenant with Israel will be taught at the beginning of the Great Tribulation. We don't know. It may be even at the end, close to the fulfillment of chapter 18. Personally, I have no idea. Maybe one of you have a better idea. But the point here is that God's in control and that He uses even these 10 kings to fulfill His judgment. We find that many times in the Old Testament also that God would use heathen nations even to chastise Israel. He used the Assyrians to chastise Israel. He used the Babylonian Empire to chastise the two tribes. And so He can use these heathen kings to destroy here the false profession. And verse 18 gives another detail. The woman which thou sawest is the great city. So now we have the link with chapter 18, where we see the woman, the harlot, also as a city. And so that is again the contrast with what we have with the church. The true church is also a great city. And so there are also 4 cities here in this book. You have Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem. We have seen it in Revelation 11, and we hope to see it also later on in the book. You have the heavenly Jerusalem connected with the church, and in the meantime you have this apostate church connected with the great Babylon. And then you have Rome, the great city of Rome, as a political entity, as the center, the headquarters of the Roman Empire. So again, you have also 4 cities in the book of Revelation. Maybe for the next time you can study chapter 18 and see also how there will be many, many practical lessons for us involved. So even when we read a chapter like this, dealing with the future, there are moral lessons for us and applications to learn for us today.